Can you check the sound on the Zoom as well? Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to our conference. It's great to see so many people show up and show enthusiasm and interest in antimicrobial resistance. It's obviously a very important and challenging issue that the world faces, and it's important to learn more about it and become more aware about it as well, which is the main goal of our conference today. So my name is Martin. I'm the president of the Trinity AMR Action Group, and I'll just say a few brief words about the action group, as well as a bit more about the conference as well today. But before we begin, this is the organizing committee who put the conference together, and not just the conference, but also other events that we do throughout the year. And just a big thank you goes to all of them for their hard work and massive amount of commitment to the society. So I believe most of you are aware that it is World AMR Awareness Week. So it starts on the 18th of November and goes towards the 24th of November. It happens annually, and it's run by mainly the WHO, who put on a few different activities with the goal of raising awareness about AMR and encouraging best practices by the public, health practitioners, and basically anyone. So I thought I'd mention a few of our contributions to World AMR Awareness Week, what we're doing as part of the Trinity AMR Action Group. And part of it is that we have put together this conference, but one of the other things we have been doing is that we've put together this student guide to antimicrobial resistance. This is a guide containing what we think is very important information about the implications of AMR, why people should care about AMR, its effects, and crucially how to prevent it as a student in education. So this week we're planning on releasing it, probably later on next week at some point during World AMR Awareness Week. And if anyone would like to give it a read, the best way to do it is to follow us on our social media, where we'll be sharing the link to it, as well as on our mailing list as well, which there are a few QR codes dotted around the lecture theatre, but also in the Blue Ball Common Room where all the tea and coffee will be. So feel free to give that a scan at some point. Another one of our contributions is we are putting on a puzzle for Year 10 students across the UK. So we're working very closely with the Trinity College outreach team on this project. And the idea is that it's supposed to help the younger students engage more with AMR in an interesting and exciting way, hopefully. And we are planning on, again, releasing this later on during the week as well. This is not so much a World AMR Awareness Week contribution, but one of the activities we've been recently doing is we've been working with the Baker Lab in Sitted, down at the Geoffrey Cheer Biomedical Centre near Addenbrooke's. I've been working very closely with one of the PhD students there called Abhijit, who I'm sure some of you will know. And we are basically taking samples from the River Cam, and we are trying to identify specific antimicrobial resistance genes. And basically that will entail us sampling the river at various points, which you can see. So we take a few samples from Grantchester, and then also a few closer to the city centre, up towards Elizabeth Bridge. We'll be doing that for 11 weeks or so. I think right now we're in week 7, I think, of sampling. And the idea is we do a DNA extraction, and then we run it through a fluidigm to actually assess the presence and absence of certain markers for the resistance genes. So that's just one of the things that the society as a whole has been working on. And yeah, hopefully some of the trials have gone quite well so far. So hopefully the results we get in the end are going to be interesting. So moving on to a bit more about the conference. So this is today's schedule. I think I said in the email previously I sent out that there has been a slight change in that one of the student speakers has unfortunately had to drop out. But that just means lunch starts slightly earlier, which might be a good thing or not. Depends on you. A few housekeeping rules as well. So we will be recording on the Zoom. And we'll post the talks later on onto our YouTube channel, which is just called the Trinity AMR Action Group. So you can rewatch some of the talks if you'd like on there. Photos are welcome, of course, and I think photography will be taking place throughout the conference. If you don't want your picture taken, just please let us know and we'll try and accommodate for that as well. And also please like and share any of our pictures as well that we on social media. Some fire exit stuff as well. So the fire exits are just on the door on the right that came through, and on my left as well there is another door. In the event of a fire alarm, which we are not expecting, you would proceed out the corridor the way you came onto the court, and then the porters will be there to help escort us out. And finally, for our online audience, please stay muted with video off, but of course any questions, put them in the chat box. And oh yeah, so these were the QR codes I mentioned previously. So the left one is the mailing list. Again, they're dotted around, so you don't have to do it now. And we also have a Linktree QR code going on as well. So feel free to give this a scan as you see them around. But yeah, so that's it from me. But I will be passing on to now Dame Sally Davies, who I'm sure some of you are aware of her role in AMR. But for those who aren't, she is the Master of Trinity College, and she is the UK Special Envoy Antimicrobial Resistance. Sadly, she could not join us in person, but she has very kindly offered to film a short clip for us to watch to introduce the conference for us. So I will just hand over to her. Thank you. Share screen. Yep. Hopefully this works.
Hello. Today I'm speaking to you not only as your master, the Master of Trinity College, but also as the UK Special Envoy on Antimicrobial Resistance. I was actually appointed to this role by the former Prime Minister to work with international partners across the world to tackle one of the world's most existential but least known threats, AMR. And I want to tell you how thrilled I am that you, our Trinity students, have set up an AMR society. After all, I have been advocating for global action on AMR for almost a decade, including as the Chief Medical Officer from 2010 to 2019. In my career there, I led the Ebola response, oversaw the Novichok tragedy, and introduced the sugar levy to tackle obesity. But it is AMR that remains mine and the world's biggest challenge. So today, I thought I'd share with you how I've used my voice to break stereotypes, ceilings, and silence as a woman holding positions for the first time, as a leader and champion for global public health, and then shine a spotlight on those researchers, policymakers, and activists from across the world who are using their voices and spheres of influence to turn the tide against AMR. The key underpinning of each of these threads is credibility and using evidence to build consensus and trust, and ultimately good national and global policies. So I started out as a doctor, a practicing hematologist, and built my career outwards and upwards, of course, by focusing on the importance of research and evidence. I became the UK's first medical practitioner to specialise in sickle cell disease. And I'm proud I built a very strong clinical service in London that became the model for the UK and Europe, breaking new ground in its multi-professionalism, community-facing and patient focus. When I transitioned to the civil service, I was responsible for the development and implementation of a regional strategy for NHS R&D. And of course, I used my own experiences as a researcher to improve how our health ministry used science by re-energising and modernising research for patient benefits. So I founded the National Institute of Health Research in 2006, NIHR. I was really determined to create both the infrastructure and culture that would enable research to thrive and empower female researchers too. In 2010, I became the Chief Medical Officer, the 16th in 165 years. but the first woman to hold this title, as I am the first woman here, as the Master of Trinity College. As I stepped back from medical practice into public policy, I found it was my job to persuade scientists and policymakers across government to consider public health objectives and build sustainable action. I found myself labelled as the nation's nanny because by setting frameworks or guidelines for behaviours, I did have to be strict in order to be kind. My male predecessors and successor have each had challenges with public perception, but I had to challenge the status quo for both micro and structural inequalities. As I stepped from medical practice into public policy, I found it was my job to persuade people across government to consider public health objectives. All along, it was about bringing people together, bringing scientists and policymakers together to collect and share action, building sustainable traction. So, as CMO, it was part of my statutory duty to provide an annual report on the state of the nation's health. As scientists, I believe it is our job to bring politicians and public along with us by presenting case studies and ideas for interventions and the evidence to inform policies. The past 2-3 years of COVID-19 have shown how and why infectious disease research, policy making and advocacy are more important than usual. I learned a lot as these reports were developed. And for my first, I chose the topic of infectious diseases that we published in March 2013. And it was then that I became aware of the severity of AMR for the very first time. I'd seen it with my patients, but we always had new drugs. Now it's different. In the decade I've been advocating on it, AMR has been transformed from an acronym that few politicians had heard of to a recognised global challenge that G7 leaders have committed to act urgently on. But sadly, our reasons to act are only increasing. It's really no exaggeration to say that the last two have been the most challenging and devastating for healthcare globally. We're seeing a historically unprecedented increase in global poverty and now inflation, with the World Bank estimating that 97 million poor people were in poverty in 2020. The World Health Organization has estimated that the disruption to health services contributed to 14 million malaria cases and 69,000 deaths from malaria last year. All the while, 3 billion people worldwide lack hand-washing facilities at home, as we know, one of the most basic measures to prevent infections. But it's important to understand our inequalities and inaction now are driving the third leading cause of death, behind only ischemic heart disease and stroke. Because in February, the world's first and most comprehensive estimates of the global burden of AMR to date were published. Researchers from Oxford and the University of Washington analysed 204 countries' data, 471 million individual health records, and revealed truly harrowing data. Over 1.2 million deaths were attributed directly to AMR in 2019, making bacterial AMR a bigger killer than each of HIV, TB, or malaria. Not surprisingly, the highest burden of AMR was found in sub-Saharan Africa, with 255,000 deaths attributed to AMR. That's at least 24 deaths per 100,000 of the population. 6 pathogens accounted for 72% of the deaths: E. coli, Staph aureus, Klebsiella, Strep pneumoniae, Acinetobacter, Pseudomonas. Of these, the most fatal pathogen globally was E. coli. And of course, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, MRSA, remains a really significant global burden, even though it's not on the WHO's priority list for new antibiotic treatments. This data must be a wake-up call for the world for how and where we've got to target and tackle infections. And I think it shows there's no time, nor should there be excuses left before people act. For the 4.95 million people whose deaths were connected to AMR in 2019, it's too late already. Our global systems failed them, and we continue to fail our own global systems with mounting scientific evidence that antibiotic residues are polluting our waterways. For instance, another major study reported recently of over 250 rivers from 100 countries found 1/4 of these rivers were polluted to toxic levels. Madrid, having the most polluted river in Europe, ranking in the top 10% of global places with the highest cumulative concentration of active pharmaceutical ingredients, and Glasgow came in the top 20%. Do you know there were only 2 places in the world unpolluted? Iceland and a Venezuelan indigenous village. The data points to lower middle-income countries being most affected. Insights from this study can and should help incentivize action at local, national, regional and global levels. And we've got to invest smartly for the future in systemic solutions, infection prevention and control, improved sanitation and access to clean water, R&D for diagnostics, novel therapeutics and vaccines. And the intervention will build our capability to tackle other future global challenges, including pandemics. Yes, it's taken decades to get to the COP26 levels of momentum on climate change, COP27 around the corner. AMR activism on all levels is at least 10 years behind. So we've got to look both top down and bottom up to inspire and empower us. So let's shine a light on you, activists, students, as well as innovative researchers and global advocates. We need behavioural and policy change. So think about how the global scientific community were able to develop COVID-19 vaccines rapidly. That's because they built on years of earlier investment and research. For AMR, a lot of that research is happening, but the antibiotic market is so broken. Only 5 of the 12 antibiotic companies that have gone public in the last decade are still active. 4 of the companies were acquired, 2 went through reverse merger processes due to trials failure, and 1 company that reached FDA approval simply went extinct post-bankruptcy. It's dreadful. And this isn't lack of research or even success. The success rate from phase 1 to FDA approval in the last decade was over 16% for antibacterial new chemical entities, actually more than double the overall average success rate. Between 2019 and 21, there were 22 projects that left the pipeline due to discontinuation or disinvestment. But during this time, 38 new projects entered that pipeline, and most of these are innovative rather than adaptive. But that innovation also has to translate into access. And as it stands, our Access to Medicines Foundation latest AMR benchmark found that 2/3 of products have no access plan attached to them. So innovative treatments may never make it to wards or patients to be used, especially in those low and middle income countries most vulnerable to infection who need these treatments the most. So to address these economic problems, as you may know, I spent a lot of last year working with G7 and the G7 countries to improve market conditions for antibiotic developments. And the G7 finance ministers made commitments on AMR for the first time ever, emphasising the role of pull incentives. And we in the UK, England, have been driving forward progress with our own innovative subscription. We often call it the Netflix model, the world's first system to pay for antibiotics by subscription. And this approach has benefited patients by guaranteeing both sustainable and use and sustainable supply of 2 antibiotics so far. And we've got them now in use. Well, I also want to talk to you about the Pasteur Act in the US, which some of you will know has bipartisan support in the Congress. This would put in place in the US a subscription mechanism similar to ours in England by investing, originally the plan was $11 billion, it's now $6 billion over 10 years, based on the assessed value of drugs to patients. Crucially, this would ensure patients covered by federal insurance programs can access treatments at no cost while guaranteeing some revenue for the companies so they go on developing new drugs. The Pasteur Act also has provisions for stewardship. which requires countries to develop education and communication strategies. This act, if it could pass, would send a massive signal to the world and take us a long way forward, showing that the challenging market failure can be overcome. It shows us what a future could look like with a level playing field. And that's why everyone's got to help campaign for this act, signing petitions, engaging with Congress, writing letters to policymakers. Well, moving to other issues, you know as well as I do, every day counts in a pandemic. So it's important to have surveillance with data that's openly accessible. We from the UK fund the Fleming Fund, a major international aid investment dedicated to AMR, supporting 24 countries across Africa and Southeast Asia, building a laboratory capacity, infrastructure and capability to generate data, share it and use data to inform decision-making at national and global level. We bring evidence and people together to support countries. And on the ground, that data can empower the actual healthcare workers with the tools they need. Actually, it was our investment through the Fleming Fund on genomic sequencing in South Africa that contributed to the identification of the beta COVID-19 variant and later Omicron. Meanwhile, in Uganda, the Fleming Fund investments enabled local researchers to gather 9,000 samples from livestock and people across Uganda to look at how resistant bacteria transfer between humans and animals. And that way, you can start to convince policymakers to put in place regulations to curb the misuse of antibiotics in farming. I also want to proudly recognise women who worked across the Fleming Fund, fellows like Sabrina Yasmin, who did a study on how antibiotics are labelled in Bangladesh, Susan Gitty, who recently submitted Kenya's first AMR datasets to the World Health Organization, and Gabriel Ack, who's mapping AMR surveillance data pathways to understand need in Papua New Guinea. Data's important in every country, and here in the UK, researchers from Guy's and St Thomas's have shown that same-day testing can successfully identify secondary infections for COVID-19 patients in ITUs in just a few hours. That helps, and it can really work with influenza patients this winter too. Meanwhile, in the city of Kano in the Central African Republic, Médecins Sans Frontières pioneered the rollout of mini labs, condensing lab equipment into a 20 square metre container that's transportable and affordable, so clinicians can adapt treatments to infections they're presented with and know how infections and antibiotic resistance is in their communities. So we've got innovation all across the world. Actually, many of you will know that in 2020, in response to COVID-19, I launched the Trinity Challenge with prizes in 2021. It was a new coalition of diverse partners committed to using data and analytics to generate and recognise best thinking to make us better prepared for health emergencies. We brought together public, private and academics to identify, respond to and recover better from health emergencies by finding new tools. The grand winner, I was delighted, was participatory One Health disease detection pod from Open Dream in Thailand. We gave them £1 million to develop how they use frontline farmers to become disease detectives. It's fantastic. They're now working with over 20,000 farmers in Thailand, and they're moving into Cambodia, India, Indonesia, Laos, and Uganda and Vietnam over the next few years. And I'm delighted to tell you, I have now had to confirm the £3 million grant from the Wellcome Trust to develop a Trinity Challenge on data outside hospitals, One Health for AMR. So we're going to be getting going with that. Remember, 80% of antibiotics at least are used in animals rather than for humans. So we need consumers to pressure supermarkets and fast food chains to supply protein that hasn't been pumped with antibiotics. The chain reaction scorecard from fast food chains across the US and their antibiotic use policies and practices for sourcing meat and poultry is a wonderful example. And we can see the leaders like Chipotle, who serves only beef who haven't had routine use of antibiotics, Shake Shack with responsibly raised beef, and the sales figures confirm that better beef is good for company bottom lines. On the other end of this is Wendy's, who lagged behind, cutting the use of only one medically important antibiotic of 12 possibly, and only by 20% in only 30% of its beef supply. Not good enough. Meanwhile, McDonald's have announced a policy to eliminate the use of highest priority critically important antibiotics in their chickens by 2027. But that's got to remain on track. We have to keep checking that they're doing what they should do, they're doing what they promised. And some of you students from Trinity College, I'm very proud of, have gone to the AGMs of Yummy, the parent company of KFC, McDonald's and Pizza Hut, to pressure their stakeholders to agree to carry out a gap analysis reporting on the use of antibiotics in their supply chains. As a result, Yum did become the first public company to agree to disclose its impact on the broad economy and diversified shareholders. That's a real leadership issue from you, our youth, and I hope you will encourage other students to take a stand with activist investing too, as well as on other AMR issues. From the UK, we also launched the Investor Action on AMR initiative, calling on investors to commit to making sustainable investments and aligning with global best practices on AMR by incorporating AMR into their ESG standards. We've got 15 big investors across the world with a portfolio of $11 trillion signed up. Yes, we've got global levels and leaders at every level, bringing passion and determination to bear for AMR. I see all of you as leaders too. Just look at your new student AMR guide. Many of you will also have seen the Prime Minister of Barbados, Her Excellency Mia Mottley, capture the world's attention by speaking truth to power at COP26 of the UN General Assembly recently. Thankfully, she, the Prime Minister, is also on the side of AMR as co-chair to the UN Global Leaders Group on AMR. I'm honoured to be a member of this group, and we're pushing above all to ensure that the crippling inequality caused by and playing out during COVID-19 doesn't define our future on AMR too. And we're working hard to position AMR at the top of the political agenda. Indeed, we now have agreement there will be a high-level meeting on AMR in the UN General Assembly Heads of Government Week in 2024. So, I firmly believe that some of the greatest demonstrations of leadership are not just in the UN debating chambers. I actually want to tell you about a young man I met recently, Eric Venant, the founder and CEO of Rollback Antimicrobial Resistance Initiative. He's a pharmacist in Tanzania. He uses arts, crafts and drama to share accessible and understandable messages about AMR to children, empowering them to act as agents for change for their families and communities. He's even put posters on tuk-tuks and educated drivers to pass on messages to their passengers. We can also look at exciting initiatives to improve capacity among stakeholders in high-income, low and middle-income countries. One is the Commonwealth Partnership for Antimicrobial Stewardship, working between UK and across Africa, creating a board game for staff to teach antimicrobial stewardship. And I was thrilled to see the progress they've made since 2019, leveraging the expertise of NHS institutions, volunteers and technical experts, strengthening capacity in Ghana, Tanzania, Uganda and Zambia in antimicrobial stewardship. Meanwhile, the team at MedSure have developed not just an app, but a whole network of 1.6 million registered clinicians globally, sharing knowledge between peers. And their AMR program for community healthcare workers and pharmacists promotes awareness of AMR and builds both confidence and skills for effective stewardship. We've got a strong AMR community, but it's too small. There's plenty of room for more students and people generally to join us. We need you. Despite the growing political action on AMR, there's still inequity in access to knowledge and education about AMR. Public engagement doesn't currently match the scale of the threat. This is going to directly impact our ability to change behaviours and policies. So I want to tell you about an extraordinary, out-of-the-box solution we've got to help solve this. We're working with the Rockefeller Foundation and the CDC Foundation, and it's a new musical theatre production about AMR. It is called The Mold That Changed the World. It's a musical of the story of Fleming's life. It's shown at the Edinburgh Fringe in 2019 and this year, 3 weeks each, to sell-out audiences, and we're taking it to the States. The message is educate, and the language of drama resonates, and the power of arts brings AMR to new audiences so they can join the movement of change. Do you think we should ask our Trinity Choir to work in Cambridge with schools and school children to do this musical for us? It's going to begin a US tour, starting in Washington, because that's where the Pasteur Act is, but it's also going down to Atlanta later this year. There are a core number of professional singers as the soloists, but then it has local people, healthcare workers, microbiologists, science teachers, STEM students, etc., in the chorus, giving trusted members of local communities a platform and developing credible champions for AMR. I'd love to see us doing that here. Finally, I want to highlight that I think AMR is something you need to take a big interest in because it's an intergenerational issue. We, the older generation, have used the antibiotics. You need to fight for better surveillance, more new antibiotics and better treatments to save not only modern medicine, but the lives of yourselves and your children in the future. So I think you'll see how I've used my position to speak truth to power on AMR. I was actually honoured to be invited to the US Presidential Advisory Committee on combating antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Luckily, it's got an acronym, PACCARB, PACCARB. That group provides advice, information and recommendations to their Secretary for Health. And I made clear in the meeting that engaging youth has to be one of our top priorities, that we as an AMR community must tell stories that mean something to the media and something to politicians. I've worked alongside some wonderful politicians, public servants, and spoken to actors across the UN system, industry, civil society, and academics. But truly, if we're going to survive AMR, and we've got to make it everyone's business, if AMR is to have a voice as a global challenge, then we need to give everyone a voice on it. I really hope you, our AMR society, will use your voices to make a big difference too. Thank you.
So big thanks to Sally for obviously filming that, even though she couldn't make it in person. So we'll move swiftly on to our next speaker of the day. We have Dr. Nick Brown speaking for us, and he'll be giving a talk on has there been progress in the development and use of diagnostic tests to combat AMR?